This summer, as Catholics across the country stand up for their religious liberty, we thought it might be nice to feature Bookmark episodes from years past that deal with the faith of our founders and the first of our First Amendment rights. We hope you enjoy the following interview from our archives.
And welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Today our guest author is Janice T. Connell, author of Faith of Our Founding Father, published by Hatherley Press. Welcome to Bookmark. Janice, great to have you here.
Oh, it's lovely to be here.
Okay. It's also called The Spiritual Journey of George Washington. Now here we are talking about the Founding Father and the faith of the Founding Father. Why was that important to you? Why is that important to any of us to understand, especially in this day and age?
What a wonderful question. Well, personally, when I found some hidden information about George Washington, namely an event that occurred at Valley Forge, I really began to think there was a great deal more to this man than I had ever perceived when I was studying him in school. So I decided to do a little research here, there, and the other place, just in passing. And I went to Valley Forge, to the museum, and I found his jacket with the bullet holes in him right over the heart, right over the lungs, right at the back. And yet he wasn't killed, so I asked some of the directors there if they knew anything about armor he might have been wearing. And they assured me he had nothing under that but the normal things one would wear, and that the normal man would have readily been killed with that kind of assault. So that didn't make sense, so I needed to do more research. So I started to buy the books of the biographers of George Washington and read them. And the more I read about him, the more astonishing his spiritual journey was, because those things don't happen to an ordinary mortal. And then one day, when I was working on a project in Washington, I encountered a minister who gave me a little book that had George Washington's handwritten prayers in it.
Okay.
And when I read those prayers, the tears fell down my face, and I realized he knew the Lord in ways I'd like to know the Lord. Mm-hmm. And once I saw that, I began to put two and two together and realize that in my judgment, and who am I? I'm just an observer of history. However, I really believe the encounter he had at Valley Forge was the Blessed Virgin, because St. Louis de Montfort teaches us that the quickest and the easiest way to Jesus is through Mary.
Because that's on page 121 in your book, you say that at Valley Forge, a mysterious and unidentified beautiful woman from heaven appeared to console, inspire, and guide the needy General Washington, and the beautiful woman may have been the Blessed Mother.
Then in the next paragraph, I actually go on and say what I think, but it's my opinion that he never identified her, but he gave enough facts about her that it would fit within the parameters of what we know about approved apparitions of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Mm-hmm. But I didn't know enough then until I found his handwritten prayers and realized I needed to study more. So I began to read. He wrote 4,000 letters. So if you really want to know the character of a man, read what he writes. Right. So I would say that I've read all 4,000.
That many?
I mean, I've been working on this for 12 years.
It's taken you 12 years actually to research and put this together.
Oh yes, I never thought it would be a book. I was just so interested in him.
And what was it that you came across that gave you this idea, this story?
The story of Valley Forge.
Okay.
Once Valley Forge became a hearsay, it's a hearsay. Mm-hmm. We don't.
But was that something you were researching at the time because you were thinking the book?
No, I was writing the book Meetings with Mary.
Okay, so you were writing a different book at the time.
I was, and this came across my desk, and I thought the source was good, but it's a second-level hearsay. Mm-hmm.
And you're an attorney by training, so.
If I'd had it in Washington's handwriting, I think we could have shouted it from the rooftops, but it was an eyewitness account from an eyewitness. So, but it made me interested in him. And then as I began to research, I'd pick up a book from one of his wonderful biographers. And then I began to think I had to read his own writing to see what kind of character the man had. Because if he did see the Blessed Virgin, if he was what we call visionary, then he had a destiny. And if he had a destiny, our country has a destiny. Our nation has a destiny. And if Christ lived in that man, then he was very specifically chosen. And the more I learned about him, the more I saw that life's circumstances for him were the building blocks of a nation that the world needs.
Well, it's interesting too, because obviously over the last year with the election that just passed, there's been just this kind of rancor that's been out there for a while about the separation of church and state, and many times people go and question the belief systems of the founding fathers, because the Christians will say, well, the founding fathers were Christians, and the secularists will say, well, they really weren't. And certainly in the case of Jefferson and Franklin, maybe some deism put in there. But in reading this book, Washington was a Christian.
Oh, unquestionably. And it's so inaccurate for anyone who purports to be a historian who would dare to say that Washington was a deist hasn't done any homework. He's not a real historian. He hasn't read the documents. He hasn't read the facts. So we're not talking about the others. We're talking about George Washington. He was a profound Christian. In fact, when he was president, he had an aide who said that every night the general stayed true to his life habits, and at 9 o'clock he would retire no matter what was going on. And so the servant peeked. I think that's kind of nice, the way we could put that.
Right.
Spied, however one would do it, and he saw the general on his knees with an open Bible. And that ties right back to what happened to George Washington when he was a little boy. When he was 11, his father died, leaving him the oldest of 6 children with a very grief-stricken mother who was rather poor, actually. And she handed George, aged 11, a Bible and said, "My son, everything you need to know to be successful in this life and the next is contained in these pages. Study it well and you'll want for nothing."
Now, was it his
And he believed her.
Now, was his father a minister or was his grandfather?
No, his grandfather.
His grandfather was a
a
Puritan?
minister, a Puritan minister, an
right.
Anglican priest, actually. And he was run out of England because he continued to say Mass at a time when that was not...
He was a little too Catholic.
Very much too
right,
Catholic.
Right, in a sense, right?
And so they called him a drunkard. They really criticized him, and young John Washington, his son, couldn't bear the persecution. And so he came to the United States and he tried to live the faith. And of course, the Washington family was very faith-filled through the centuries.
Now, you say in the foreword here that George Washington has much to teach the world today. First, he was born into rather ordinary circumstances. Secondly, he used the opportunities life presented him to feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, clothes and shelter the needy, etc. Thirdly, and undoubtedly the most significant, he never allowed success or failure to corrupt him.
Yes.
Now, you spent a lot of your life working in Washington, D.C.,
Yes.
around the political system, right?
Yes.
So this would be something that you would say is sorely needed, right?
Oh, Washington is such a hero for our times. They wanted to make him king, and he had the power and the authority to do so. He thought that was ridiculous. His whole understanding of Christ made him, he was considered the most humble man alive, and yet he had more power than anyone on this continent. When he died, the son of the king he defeated in battle said of him, "George Washington is the greatest man who ever lived." He was great because he was so humble. He was humble, the record's so clear. He was humble because he knew Christ.
And that's the sense in reading his letters that you got.
Oh, yes. His self-esteem was rooted in the gospel. His self-esteem was rooted in Jesus Christ.
Appropriate way of getting self-esteem, right?
Oh.
As opposed to the way it's kind of...
But there is no other
with
way.
today.
Anything else is
a
terminus.
facade,
It ends
right.
at death.
Right.
And if you could read his death scene in there, just know how, as you see through the book, how he prepared, how his prayers prepared him every moment for that great moment when he would encounter Christ and would be held accountable for every moment.
And speaking of that and the Catholic aspect, there's a Catholic connection to his death, right?
Yes, and the problem in the colonies was that we didn't have very many priests. But George Washington's business partner was Daniel Carroll, whose brother was John Carroll,
It was a
who
familiar name,
who
right?
had been run out of France, as the statement goes, because he was a Jesuit. And there was tremendous religious persecution going on in France.
Right.
So he learned, I mean, his best friend was a very devout Roman Catholic. He himself was trained as an Anglican Catholic. He knew our faith.
Right.
He was present when the United States was consecrated to the Immaculate Heart of Mary.
Was he present at that occasion?
Well,
You think he might have been.
I would venture that he was present, but I
Because you say
have
the
no,
Washington and Carroll families were quite close. On June 11, 1799, 6 months before Washington's death, Archbishop John Carroll conferred and dined with Washington at Mount Vernon.
Yes, and there was a very strange dream that Washington had that let him know that his death was imminent, and he understood dreams. He was a man of such deep prayer that he knew, as we know and we're taught in our faith by so many of the saints, that we will have a warning of our death and a chance to go have, look, the 9 First Fridays, the first Saturdays, God promises that we will not die without the sacraments. And so this makes some sense, that he had the dream, that he had the meal with Bishop Carroll. He was present when the stone was cast for the beginning of Georgetown University, the first Catholic university in North America.
Right. And I know even in his sympathy in a sense, because I know there's a couple of times I think when the invasion of Canada, he makes it clear of how the religion of the Catholics is to be respected.
Well, we have to look at the history of the times. At the time of George Washington, many countries were shaking off the shackles, if you will, of nations that were ruled by secular rulers who were beholden to the Pope. And so...
Well, we're dealing with the post-Reformation.
Yes, that whole era.
Period, right.
And so it's very good to see that we're grown up now. Vatican II taught us that we need to be properly formed in the jewels of our church, the gifts of the patristic fathers, so that we know our faith and we can make informed decisions on, we need a properly formed conscience. That's the gift that I found in George Washington. And what's so amazing with him is that his colleagues saw it too. They saw the ability this man had to discern right from wrong, and he articulated it in a very simple manner. He was never grandiose. He talked about God's will, staying in God's will. And some of the military historians I've been blessed enough to do some research with talk about some of the battles that he fought. Remember, this was a Virginia farmer taking on the heaviest standing army there was when we went up against England, and they all noted that the record's very clear that Washington prayed a great deal before battle. And he didn't win most of the battles, he just didn't lose them.
Right, in fact, I guess that's where one would think you really hold on to your faith, is when things are going the wrong way.
Yes, and I think I'm going to write a little book about the Battle of Trenton, because it's just miraculous. However, I need more data. You can't just say that. I have to find people who know what the tides were like at that date, as best as we can go back and look into
crossing the Delaware.
Yes, and getting all those men transported, and where did he get his battle plans? There are those who would say that he got his battle plans in prayer. If so, then the Lord had a direct hand through Washington in the founding of our country.
Jan, what do you say to somebody who says, because you talk about patriotism in this book and tying that together with the faith, and again, in our culture today, sometimes it becomes, well, the radical right is taking religion and co-opting it and marrying with patriotism, and gee, here's a war. Now, war is a terrible thing. People die. Is God really taking sides? Is God really allowing Washington to succeed crossing the Delaware to defeat the Hessians, and the Hessians, who many of them were probably Catholic, ended up dying in that battle? How does that work? Does God take sides?
I love that question. I've pondered that myself for many years. I can tell you this about, I don't know that I could answer that question, but I'm praying about it too. But Washington had an interesting experience when he was 23 years old. He was very ill in the back of a wagon going to the Battle of Fort Duquesne.
Okay.
And he studied...
That was in the French and Indian War,
yes,
right? Okay.
And he studied warfare in the Old Testament. He studied the Old Testament, and he used what he learned in the Old Testament in light of those sayings of Jesus. He knew Christ's words in the New Testament, and he fought his wars based on the tenets of the Bible.
So there was this total underpinning into everything that he did.
Absolutely, and he certainly was aware of David and Goliath when he took on the Revolutionary War. So if God's hand was not there, that's why when he knelt in the snow at Valley Forge, most of his colleagues were back in Philadelphia cutting deals with the Brits so they wouldn't be hung as traitors, and Washington knelt in the snow, and I can just visualize his prayer, Lord, where did I step out of your will? Look at my starving men. This is not how you are. You're the God of love and mercy and kindness. Are we out of your will? And that's when the beautiful lady from heaven came to him. Isn't that amazing?
Right. No, it's actually quite amazing because it was the first time I had ever read anything along those lines in relation to. I had heard possibly in other books in the past about him maybe being in a battle, and it appeared like here's the 6'4" giant for the time, a wonderful target, and somehow seemed to be able to come through these battles unscathed.
Yes, read what his officers say about him. He was the man they couldn't kill. Read what the Native Americans said about him. In fact, there's one prophecy by a chief, a Native American chief, that I think is so amazing. I had to put it in the book.
Well, do you have the sense from reading the books about him, what you talk about him, that this difference in him was obvious to those
yes.
who dealt with him?
And at the Constitutional Convention, if you think about it, here was this tall man. I love to hypothecate. You know, it's fun to look at history and try to figure out why certain rumors started. For example, the rumor that George Washington didn't speak because he had bad teeth.
Right.
That's ridiculous. I mean,
well, he didn't have wooden teeth, I know that.
Well, it's ridiculous. He didn't speak because he was so steeped in humility. He had mastered the gift of silence. I believe the record would stand that he had that amazing gift of living in the presence of God at all times.
Well, then you talk about it's the now, it's not
he
tomorrow,
lived in
it's the now.
the eternal now.
Right.
So that his deathbed scene shows that he was so aware of that. He gave up his last command, holding his pulse. He knew that he was in command of this body as long as he lived on the earth.
Well, I know Mother Angelica is someone who's always talked about the idea of living in the now.
Yes, and George Washington did.
Okay.
In every battle, he was ready to go. He felt it was God's will. And when you live in the eternal now, that's why Valley Forge is so seminal. Nothing looked right. And he got down on his knees in front of the men, and it was, where have I misunderstood you? And at that moment, as history shows, many of the great nations were founded by apparitions of the Blessed Virgin Mary.
Well, it's also interesting too because there's another connection here, because you talk about obviously with the death of his father at a young age, that there was these 110 rules for young gentlemen, which you lay out in here, and rules of civility that have a connection, I think a Jesuit connection
They do,
here.
yes.
And they're very important to him about how he would lead his life, right? What's
interesting is a Jesuit who became an Anglican priest in the United States. Now, I don't have enough facts on that Reverend Mary, M-A-R-Y-E. Might have pronounced it Marie, but he was a former Jesuit.
Right.
And he became an Anglican priest. And some of our experts who understand those times and the relationship between the Anglican and the Roman Church in a colony, in a place far away, we don't know why that happened.
Right.
But he taught George Washington and several other young boys. George was 13 at the time. He not only memorized those rules, but he insisted that his officers and all those with whom he worked lived under those rules of civility. And they're steeped out of the Ignatian rules of discernment.
Well, it says, when you fulfill a mission, do it without passion and with discretion, however mean the person to be for whom you do it. When your superiors talk, listen eagerly and neither speak nor laugh. So there's a lot of discipline in here.
And his whole life was lived through those rules of civility, which I would do well to learn those and try to live by.
I think all of us would in reading through this. I mean, he really makes you realize that, you know, unlike, a lot of us like to believe, I think, in a celebrity culture, that people are just born a certain way. They're either lucky and they happen to achieve success, or they're just born that way. They're different. And really, we don't realize until we get into people's lives how much of this was work, how much of it was preparation.
Oh, yes.
There might have been a certain openness and spirituality there, but it had to be nurtured on his part as well. We all have free will.
That's so
He had to
true.
be open to that and see the importance of that in his
Well,
life.
did you see the prayers in there in his own handwriting?
Right.
If it's true, what the record says, that he prayed those day and night, how could he not grow very deeply in the ways of Jesus?
Well, you got to say here, Washington believed that God's mercy is his reward for those who seek him. and that Washington dared not interfere in God's timetable of revelation. Washington's prayers unveil his own humble and contrite heart, which God did not spurn. And you have his Sunday morning prayer. This he would say, because it's every day of the week. He's got
Yes.
a morning prayer
And an evening prayer.
and it's Almighty God and most merciful Father, who didst command the children of Israel to offer a daily sacrifice to thee, that thereby they might glorify and praise thee for thy protection both night and day. Receive, O Lord, my morning sacrifice, which I now offer up to thee. Now, if he's not a Christian, I don't know what he is.
He was
right?
offering his whole life as a
Right.
sacrifice in union with Jesus. Now, you said, was he born to this aristocracy? Did it all just come easily?
Right.
Absolutely not. He had to work so hard. His first job at 17 was a surveyor, because remember, his dad died and his mother was poor. And he had to support her and those younger siblings. So he got a paying job out of the state of Virginia as
Now,
a surveyor.
Did he have a half-brother?
He did.
Lawrence?
Lawrence was his older half-brother, who married very serendipitously. He married the daughter of Lord Fairfax, who was the richest man in Virginia. And that was a serendipity because Washington could go to Belvoir, which was their estate, and he could observe, and we become what we observe. So here was a man of the frontier,
Right.
who could be with the highest aristocracy of the colonies and learn the fine manners. And he disciplined himself so that he could be as comfortable with the highest ranking people as well as the lowest Indian down in the trenches. And you know the story of how the Indian shot him. And
Right.
it didn't touch his body, but he brushes off the gun. Is it gunpowder that he'd get all over him? And this poor Indian thought that this was a god because he couldn't kill him, this big, tall white man. And he said the Indian is kneeling, quaking. And the story is just so dear. Washington, 22 years old, reaches down and picks him up and shakes him and says, "I'm not a god, I'm a man just like you. And don't you ever do that to me again."
Right, exactly.
So this man had the manners of the highest of the aristocracy in the colonies and was just as comfortable in the wilderness, because I believe, if I could only find the missing link here, I believe he knew Christ. And Christ is there for everyone.
Right. Well, he writes in George Washington's Monday morning prayer, it says, "Direct my thoughts, words, and work. Wash away my sins in the immaculate blood of the Lamb. Purge my heart by thy Holy Spirit from the dross of my natural corruption." Obviously a man who was quite in touch with his humanity and with the eternal aspect of life.
Yes.
Now you said, I forget, before the interview, did you talk about, took you 12 years of working
At least 12.
on this.
I've been looking everywhere. I'm still interested. I'm still looking. And I've got a new project going. I have a hunch. I just came back from Spain, from Santiago. I have a hunch that there's a story about Christopher Columbus that we don't know.
Really? Well, he could use some good publicity because
Yes, he could.
he's been
Yes, he
getting
could.
ripped pretty good lately.
I know.
In the section, chapter 5, Washington's faith, I just thought this line, it says, "The fate of unborn millions will now depend under God on the courage and conduct of this army." And that was him talking, but I think you think of the fate of unborn.
That's
and,
us.
And us, and as well as even from a pro-life perspective now.
Oh, yes.
Of how much of that. "We have therefore to resolve to conquer or die." You say the duty forced George Washington to abstain from things and places of the world. His ways melted into God's will, for the Lord gave him no other choices. Gradually in prayer and scripture he recognized God's hand. He heard God's voice. Graced discipline led him to the desert of obedience.
What an amazing man.
Yes, much different in many ways than certainly we've been, we might have got a very kind of cartoonish version of him as kids, and later on, through the revisionists, kind of the secular aspect was played out. And the religious aspect of the founding fathers, and especially George Washington, was kind of, I guess, pushed into the background.
Well, I have an etching, not an etching, I guess a cartoon of him when he died. And he was, at his death, he was mourned as a saint.
Wow.
The people canonized him as a saint, and there's an image of him with a halo and with little wings and just looking like...
So it's just the way people thought about him at that time.
Oh,
And am I right in understanding that we believe that the last rites were possibly given by Catholic priests?
Well, by Father Neil, a Jesuit.
Okay. So he actually died with the last rites of
Yes.
the Catholic Church, as far
That's
as we
what the
know.
record shows.
Just before we go, what's next for you?
Well, I'm working on another book about Our Lady. It's
Okay.
called Mary's Secrets, Gifts from the Blessed Mother.
Okay.
I'm trying to study all those gifts, the wonderful jewels of the church that Mary kept hidden in her heart.
Okay, great.
So that's fun. And then sometime I might look into Christopher Columbus.
Okay, great, Jan. Thank you so much for
Oh, bless your heart.
keep up the good work. Speaking here with Janice T. Connell, author of Faith of Our Founding Father. It's published by Hatherley Press, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. Check it out. I'm Doug Keck. Check us out next time right here on EWTN's Bookmark.